making my custom milkshake of 2 scoops of this, 1 scoops of this. This is a vegan plant product powder composite, and this is egg powder. I currently, for the last time, not for the last time, but for recent time, in the last couple of years, I have searched again for the answer to the question: what about vegetables? If I have just a milkshake, and this could be either a milkshake that is basically mixed like this, but also is mixed by myself. What about the vegetables? And so I had multiple answers for this. First of all, I added frozen vegetables, which you can find already cut in the supermarket. I added these and mixed it basically with these 2 components. I in the past still used normal eggs, and then I made a very big pot of basically all of these different ingredients. I also added vinegar. I also added back then still different kinds of oils, in order to also have them in there, since olive oil seem to have some health benefits. And I then would mix them or have them in these smaller ceramic bowls, which I then would make in the microwave. So there I would have basically the frozen vegetables in there. Now over time I realized the following: at least once in a given day I usually eat normally anyway. That's usually kind of the late afternoon or dinner. So in this I also kind of can now rely on my body's want for vegetables. So I usually have 1 or 2 salads in a day, and so this also could be 1 or 2 carrots basically during the day, or sometimes it's this. So I kind of ask myself, or I ask the rest of my body what it kind of wants, and then it usually stirs me towards one kind of vegetables. So the first, but nonetheless this does not take away from the attempted approximation of the ideal of, okay, what if I just have one shake that covers all of my nutritional needs? So what I have now is basically this here, and it is, you could also call basically these different ingredients in there already vegetables. So you have these different protein powders basically that are in there. Now, one solution to this would be to buy something that contains all of these different vegetables, maybe in a powdered form, which I then could just add. So there is not something like just a standardized vegetable powder that you can just get. What there is, at least as of currently, is there are a couple of greens powders. Now, greens are not exactly identical to vegetables, but also some of the big benefits from vegetables seem to stem from especially the green vegetables. So the greens, to a certain extent, maybe are even kind of the better vegetables, one could argue, but I'm not so sure about this. So the problem, I think, to a certain extent with the green powder is, or the greens powders, which are offered by many different companies these days, you probably can find dozens or hundreds of listings of greens powders on Amazon, and then you can try to compare the prices and how much you are supposed to have from this in a given day. So I did this for 3 main companies, and the 3 main companies are Athletic Greens, so this sells, at least in Germany, for around 80 euros per month. The portion is then 12 grams in a given day. The resulting cost per portion would be around 2.50 euros. I then did this for Huel. Huel sells not in Germany, but if I would take the UK or the US price, I think I took the US price, and I would say, okay, I converted the currency, then this would result in 1.50 euros for a given portion, which then would be, I think, 10 grams in a given day, and this would result in 1.50 euros per serving, and this is the recommended serving. And I also took a look at the company I buy my protein powder from, which is this company, and here 1 tablespoon, which is the kind of recommended dose, or also at least 3, so there are these smaller scoops which contain roughly 3.5 grams, at least in terms of creatine. The density of the different powders might vary. So 3.5 scoops of this results in 9 grams of powder that looks like this, and this costs me 60 cents per daily portion, which is roughly, I calculated, 1 tablespoon then. I think it's easier to have just 1 tablespoon instead of 3.5 of these. Now, I think it would make sense if I said, okay, I want to make my custom milkshake that contains already vegetables, that I would rely on something like a greens powder. But I currently have not kind of the agency, or I didn't ascribe, I think is the right word, myself the agency to determine kind of different additional things so much of my milkshake. The milkshake should consist out of ingredients that are usually low in price and that satiate kind of mostly the macronutrient needs, but also basically satiate my hunger. The additional things, the problem I think with many of these is that you cannot really find out whether they have a health benefit or whether they don't have a health benefit. Taking turmeric or not taking turmeric is already kind of very hard to distinguish the different effects. I did this kind of multiple times. I was on and off turmeric, for example, as kind of just an example for a variable, in this case a supplement, and it seems to be the case that this helps my overall health. But in terms of the greens now, it is not as clear cut. What if you just had 10 minutes less of sleep, and then this over the course of 3 months, and when you didn't take the greens powder, and then it's just hard to isolate the variables. That's what I'm trying to say. So does it make sense to have something like this, which costs I think 60 euros per kilogram, compared to, well, normal vegetables, which if you would buy them in powdered form, I don't know what the resulting price is, but what one could also calculate is how much a spice is. So if I take, for example, the paprika spice from the supermarket, and this costs maybe 50 cents per 30 grams, if I then would take this, then that's roughly 1 cent per gram. So 1 cent per gram would roughly be 10 euros per kilogram. 10 euros per kilogram is about 1/6 of what this powder costs. So the cost seems to be reduced. So one could also maybe then make the argument, what if I just buy the vegetables that are already available in a powder form and already sell at the supermarket, and then make my own composite powder? I currently have a version of this, which is my spice mix, but there is also salt in it. But I do not have basically just the powder on its own, which I then would add. This also would introduce a lot more complexity to the calculation of one given meal shake unit, because I would then have to have the ideal ratio of all of these different things, which I would then also need to add to my fitness pal in order to then properly track my calories. At least every couple of weeks I do this. Having more than the daily recommended serving, and in terms of bulk, it is recommended to have 1 or 2. I just said, okay, I have 1, which then makes it more comparable to the other greens powders. If I already had 2, then this also would result in €1.20 in a given day. So my thinking now is this. I have these meal shakes, and if I have these meal shakes, then my body does not necessarily want micronutrients now, but it mostly wants the macronutrients. I also have my supplements as well as my multivitamin and mineral in the beginning of the day, such that the micronutrient needs are kind of already well covered. And so the additional vegetables is what then my body, after basically hours of time for the additional calculation, whatever it wants to eat, whatever this results in, I can still then kind of make up for whatever is missing. But by having basically all of what I think is useful already in the beginning of the day, and also what is algorithmically determined by Insight Tracker. So I took basically the food recommendations from Insight Tracker, and all of which I could find in a powder form, I put in my morning drink, which is then 2 tablespoons of just the powder I add to my first meal shake of the day. So by basically having, okay, in the morning I basically eat everything that I think is useful, and then as the day continues, my body can kind of re-evaluate and recalculate whatever nutrients are still left, and then out of the selection of foods I give myself, I can still kind of select out of this. So sometimes it's additional meat, sometimes it's additional tuna, sometimes it's a salad with tuna, sometimes it's, I don't know, whatever I have and whatever my body seems to think it is useful. And sometimes I basically eat until the late evening or until the late afternoon only kind of meal shakes, which then also sometimes seems to be fine. Since I then still have usually, let's just say on average, I have at least 1 small salad, which at least contains a couple of servings of vegetables, then this is already covered. But the idea was that once I started the day with basically the algorithmically determined part and also then my meal shake part, I ideally would have all nutritional needs covered already. And if a company like Fuel, for example, can just sell basically something that's very similar to this here, plus a micronutrient blend, then why can I not just have something like this here all day long, plus I also already have the eggs, and then have my multivitamin and mineral plus the supplements I take in the morning, and then have kind of a very similar solution. And I also compared the ingredients of these two, and this seems to be something that is very useful. Currently I do basically fulfill the Insight Tracker habit of 3.5 servings of vegetables with the thing I could find the closest to it in powder form, which is basically this greens powder. So I have 1 tablespoon out of the 2 tablespoons is greens powder, the other one is cocoa, but I also have a couple of other ingredients in there. I just then again simplified it to 2 tablespoons in order to not be too confusing. But something like this here doesn't contain vegetables in as of what one thinks as vegetables, as okay, have the salad and the tomato and the cucumber, but it only contains kind of plants that are still maybe considered vegetables, but it consists maybe mostly out of plants that provide macronutrients and not plants that provide mostly micronutrients and water.